students. Good afternoon or good evening, whatever time you decide to do your learning. Have you ever read a poem and when you're finished you just go, what does that even mean? You're not alone. Poetry can be really difficult to understand sometimes, but there are a lot of effective ways for deciphering it. Today we're going to talk about how to analyze poetry. Let's get into the lesson.
All right, so today we're going to talk about how to analyze a poem. So this requires a lot of reading, thinking, and repeating. You will have to read the poem more than once. Analysis equals what the poet means and how they make that meaning clear to the reader. We are going to talk about a specific type of approaching poetry, which is called the TPS-FASTT method. This is simply an acronym for giving you points to keep in mind as you are reading the poem. So the first T stands for title. You'll examine the title before you read the poem. Don't read the poem before you make predictions about the title. Next, you will paraphrase. You're going to paraphrase the literal action of the poem. Finally, in the TPS part of the TPS-FASTT, you'll look at the speaker. If you're worried that I'm going too fast right now, don't worry, we're going to go through each one of these individually. The fast part of TPS-FASTT, the F stands for figurative language. So here you will examine the poem for language that is not used literally. The A stands for attitude, also known as tone. So this is the speaker's attitude towards the subject of the poem. It's important when you get to this step that you know what the subject of the poem is, which is why paraphrasing is important, the paraphrasing that you did earlier. The S in fast stands for shifts. So here you're going to note shifts in speaker and attitude. We're going to take a little bit of a closer look at how you might notice those. The T in fast stands for title. So examine the title again, this time on an interpretive level. So now that you've read the poem, was your prediction about the title true? Did it mean what you thought it meant? And then the final T stands for theme. So this is where you're going to think about, what does this poem actually mean? Let's talk about each one of these a little bit more in depth. You're going to start by checking out the title. So before you read a poem, look at the title and think to yourself, what can you predict by looking at the title? How does the title impact the meaning of the poem? Why do you think the author titled the poem the way they did? I really want you to actually write some of these things down so that when you re-examine the title, it'll be much easier to compare your predictions to your understanding of the title at the end. Next, you're going to paraphrase confusing lines. Here is where you're going to read the poem for the first time. Read the poem, and as you do, highlight particularly confusing lines or stanzas. Paraphrase by rewriting lines in language that you understand. So if a word is really confusing, look it up and find a synonym that makes sense to you. At this point, resist the urge to analyze. A failure to understand what is literally happening in the poem often leads to an overall misunderstanding. Now you're going to read the poem again. And you're going to ask yourself, what can you infer about the speaker of the poem based on your reading? For example, how old are they? Where do you think they're from? Are they male or female? What do they value? What are their interests? You might even be able to figure out what they do for a living. There are a lot of clues within a poem that you can use to figure out information about the poet and the speaker. One thing that's really important to keep in mind here, though, is the speaker is not always the same as the poet. For example, I could write a poem from the perspective of my alarm clock. So the speaker would be my alarm clock, but I'm still the poet. So make sure you differentiate between that. Some poets get really creative with the perspective that they write from. Okay, so now we're going to look at the F in the TPS-FASTT acronym. Here you're going to look at the poem and ask yourself, what figurative language you notice? Look for personification, making something inanimate, not alive, seem animate, or alive in some way. One pro tip for looking at personification is look at how the author uses capitalization. For example, if a poet capitalizes a feeling like joy or hope, they might be trying to make that feeling seem like a person. Or, for example, in the poem To Autumn, the author capitalizes autumn because they're writing to the season as if it were a person. This is one easy way to find personification. Also look for simile. This is comparing two unlike things, often using like or as, but not always. Look for metaphor. This is saying one thing is another thing. Look for hyperbole. This is a great exaggeration for effect or emphasis. Also, look for allusion. This is referencing another work or idea of cultural, historical, or political significance. One pro tip for finding allusion is if you don't know what something is, look it up. For example, if a poet references a place, try Googling that place. Maybe a huge event happened there, like a battle or a protest. Or if a poet references a name you don't understand, like Poseidon or Ares, probably that adds meaning to the poem. And if you don't understand it, it's a great idea to use your resources. As you're looking for figurative language, don't forget about the devices of sound. Take a look at the poem and look for alliteration. So this is a repetition of a first letter of a word or words that are near each other. Assonance, the repetition of a vowel sound near each other. Consonants, the repetition of consonant sounds. Onomatopoeia, when words are used to represent sounds. Rhyme, when two words follow the same sound pattern. Remember from our rhyme lesson that you can have perfect rhyme, slant rhyme, also known as near rhyme, and internal rhyme. And repetition. So this is when a poet repeats a line or word to place emphasis on it. After you've made note of all of the types of figurative language going on in the poem, now you're going to think about the speaker's attitude or tone. Remember when we talked about speaker, that the speaker is not always the same as the poet. Keep that in mind as you're thinking about tone. Ask yourself, how does the speaker in the poem feel about the subject? For example, if the speaker is writing about cheese, do they love it? Do they hate it? Is it their favorite thing in the world, or would they rather they never had to taste it again? Here are some common words to describe tone. In addition, there's a link that is on this slide and will be in the description box below that has 155 words to describe tone. Next, we're going to look at shifts in tone. So make a note of places in the poem where the speaker's attitude towards the subject changes. Going back to the cheese example, maybe when the speaker was a kid, they loved cheese. But as they got older, they developed lactose intolerance. And now they have a love-hate relationship. In some cases, it will be really obvious where the speaker's tone changes. In others, you will have to look closely. Some pro tips. Look for stanza division. So when a stanza changes, often the tone is changing. Look for changes in line length. If there's an entire stanza with really short lines, the tone might be different than a stanza with really long, flowing lines. Changes in punctuation. Finally, after looking for punctuation, look at keywords. Are there any keywords in the poem that tell you that the speaker's tone is changing? After looking at shifts in the poem, check out the title again. Now that you have read the poem, ask yourself, did my prediction match what the poem was about? If your answer is yes, how do you understand the poem better now? Does it change the way you think about the title? If your answer is no, that you didn't predict correctly, what does the title really mean? Now that you've gone through this whole process, you get to think about theme. With all of the information that you've gathered about the poem, ask yourself, what do you think the theme of this poem is? What is the author or the poet's message? No, you want this message to be a message that can apply to many people, not just within the context of the poem. So some themes might be fate is unavoidable, or experience is what shapes us, or the past does not have to define you. Think about the messages that this author is trying to contribute by the poem that they have written. Now that we've gone through this whole process, I hope the poem that you're analyzing is a little bit easy to understand. Feel free to go back through the video and look at different parts of the TPS-FASTT method if you're still struggling to understand it. As always, ask questions if you have them. Have a great day.